So good evening, everybody. Good evening. My name's John Parker, Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association, and I'd like to welcome you all to our latest live webinar. Many thanks to all of our viewers who join us from around the world, as we can see in the chat at the moment, particularly today to everyone in the UK who's chosen to watch this instead of being outside enjoying the heat wave. I hope there's at least some of you who've got access to this in your garden with a cold drink. Before we get started, as ever, I'd encourage you to check out the online learning page on the association's website, where all of our previous webinars should now be available. I got to turn that chat off. It's far too distracting. I can't do it now. Anyway, it's fine. I'm trying to read and speak at the same time. I can't do that. So all of our webinars are available on our website. In other good news, registration is now open for the next edition of Arborist Question Time, which is 1 week from today, on July the 1st, when we'll be asking how we can achieve tree establishment instead of just tree planting. And finally, I'm also pleased to be able to tell you that the first ever Arboricultural Association online training course is now available to book. This is a digital version of our popular British Standard 3998 training course, so please take a look at that on our website. Tonight's webinar is entitled Small Trees and Big Ideas, and I'm delighted to say that we have two great presentations ahead from Amelia Williams and Rob Northrop. Each will speak for around half an hour, and then we'll make a start working through as many questions as we can, questions that you will hopefully be submitting using the Q&A button. So make sure you get your questions in. Nice and short and concise and clear, no essays for me to mark, please. We'll leave the chat on this week because as many of you are already getting stuck in, it's great to see where everybody's from, so please keep doing that. And that's it really from me. So I'm now very excited to be able to invite Amelia to the virtual stage to talk about what arborists can learn from bonsai. So Amelia, it's over to you. If you want to start sharing your screen, enjoy.
Well, thank you, John. Can you all see that? Just to confirm?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So hopefully over the next 30 minutes, I will give you a whistle-stop journey through making connections with bonsai and arboriculture. And it will be a very whistle-stop journey, and only because I say that there's so much content. I thoroughly and absolutely have a passion for trees. I love them in every way, all shapes, sizes and forms. And I've been doing arboriculture since about 2000, and I started my sort of career as a tree surveyor, worked my way through, and in about 2006 I started the hobby of bonsai. And the two I found really go hand in hand with everything you learn about trees throughout your arboricultural career, right through to everything that you can link in with every aspect of trees, I find absolutely fascinating. And I was very fortunate back in 2015 to get to go to China with the Bonsai Clubs International, and I went to an amazing pine bonsai nursery in China, and there were some stunning examples, and just seeing the trees in all their different elements and styles and shapes was just really inspirational. So in terms of the link between the two, the definition of arboriculture is the culture of trees and shrubs for arboriculture, and bonsai is the ornamental tree or shrub grown in a pot. And that's the only thing that makes it different, in the fact that sort of to grow a tree and retain it in a pot to keep it a smaller size. And so fundamentally they are one and the same in my view. So without further ado, there are very many ways that they link, but for me, 10 things that really helped me arboriculturally with my hobby and linking my arboriculture career was growing trees and learning about how they grow, looking at all aspects of trees over a longer period of time and being able to study trees in your own sort of flat originally and then back garden. I've really developed an understanding of how to grow different species. I've looked at different cultivars, and I'm really fundamentally focusing on what it takes for trees, not just to survive, but to thrive, to really sort of grow well, what takes sort of the feeding regimes, watering. It's been absolutely fundamental to actually then looking after large tree populations and actually being able to observe all the different factors around trees. I've looked also in detail at leaf modification, responses to pruning, all of this through my hobby of bonsai and transferring that across into my arboricultural career. One of the things I really loved is looking about soils, the value of soils, the different associations you get, the fungal sort of links. I've also looked at, and I'm not as good at, the artistic appreciation of shape and form, developing your bonsais to the different stages. You can start with a very simple bonsai and take it right through to a really advanced and fantastic artistic impression. And then the appreciation of trees through sort of seasons. I've really understood and enjoyed sort of like the seasonal element of trees. And rushing through, but pests and diseases, that was another fundamental thing that's really crucial on a small scale with bonsai, right through to then actually one of the things that's really helped sort of consolidate the hobby is making connections, visiting people around the country, around the world. There's over 50 sort of bonsai clubs in the UK. There's over 1,000 people that you can sort of call upon that are friends and connections in the bonsai arena. And I think that's where it's really helped link all the different elements of arboriculture with bonsai. So without further ado, rather than read through all the slides, it's just some information as I go through. But growing trees has been one of the fundamental things that's thoroughly been inspirational to the journey. So I'll talk you through my giant redwood. I have a passion for large trees, and in 2008 I was working on a development site, and I managed to get hold of some seeds of a lovely giant redwood. So I planted those up, and I was living in a flat at the time, so I could only grow them on the windowsill, but they grew. I was absolutely amazed. And then fortunately in about 2011, got to plant one of them in the ground to sort of grow it on and take it to hopefully the next level. And I was absolutely astounded at the speed at which you could get them to grow really fast with extra feeding. So sort of putting them under quite an intensive feeding regime, to finally in 2014 having developed hopefully what I would like to think is a sort of start of a bonsai. It's nowhere near the finished form. It just literally has been in a pot ready to be styled for its first styling. It will still need a lot of root development. And these are the sort of techniques all the way through your bonsai journey. Again, in terms of having fun growing seeds from seedlings, and taking them to that next stage where you actually start your own bonsai collection from scratch. So you get to control the roots from the very early stages, and you learn to grow them in different conditions. You see which soils they prefer. You watch them pop up for the first time, and it's absolutely a delight. And I think nearly everybody I've ever met has absolutely enjoyed that momentary point where their seeds pop up through the surface. And I've just in the last few days had a baobab seed pop up, which is just fun because it's just brilliant. Another thing I've linked the two really is that champion trees are sort of another passion with veterans, and actually seed collection is a really important part of arboriculture and trying to preserve the genetics and take them forward to the next sort of generation. And there was a lovely champion Indian horse chestnut in the borough I was looking after, and I managed to collect some of the seed this year and grow them on. And so I got my first batch of 50 seedlings, which are all doing well. And hopefully that champion tree will still have a few more years. But at the moment, unfortunately, it is suffering with Rigidiporus or Fraxinea. Hopefully enough work has been done to the tree to retain it in its safe environment. And I've got its future generation to plant out in the future. And really looking and linking the two techniques with bonsai and arboriculture, one of the things that's been absolutely, I suppose, enlightening was using wound sealants. During my early training back in the 2000s, a lot of people were very, not anti, but sort of dismissive of wound sealants and sort of cut paste and that sort of thing, because I think there was a whole sort of earlier explosion of these, but they weren't actually positive to tree wounding. And the more recent sort of wound pastes and putties that I found that we use in bonsai do actually work really well on actually normal mature trees as well. So a few examples in those sort of top photos is the cut paste, putty, sorry, and the bottom ones is the cut sealant, liquid. Both have different functions, but you can use them on all your cut ends when you're pruning your bonsais, and it's a way of sort of sealing the wounds to reduce the moisture loss. It also prevents bacterial infection and fungal spore infection getting into the cut ends where you've pruned all your trees. I've moved this into the bigger, larger trees. I was looking after a historic London plane on a project in London where we had a listed wall, and to have to work with how you can take down a wall and expose some sort of root area where the bark was missing, and then to sort of try and find a way of covering that to prevent sort of any infection going in. So I used the sort of bonsai liquid sort of paste as well as the putty, and created sort of an artificial sort of bark over the exposed roots. And this actually proved really successful in actually helping this process of actually the tree itself developing the callus and the occlusion over the open exposed wounds. And it's again a similar thing I used when a sycamore tree was vandalized by a chainsaw, that we applied the wound paste and putty around the wound, put some sphagnum moss in behind there to add an extra moisture layer, and then tried to encourage the tree to speed up the process of natural sealing of the wound. And the other thing we could have done with the sycamore would have been to do some sort of grafts to sort of link the two cambium layers where it was cut in between. And that's where you're trying to make those connections between the different techniques you learn in different areas of your life across. So in terms of how we use putties and pastes in bonsai, we tend to use them for every pruning that we do. We tend to apply them. So whether you're root pruning or whether you're pruning off branches, and it just helps create really good occlusions and helps the tree actually seal wounds and sort of preserves the sort of like the health of the tree from excessive moisture loss. And sorry, it's very whistle stop, but there's also the sort of element of soils. So we use a range of soils in bonsai, from akadama to kanuma, kiryu. We use pumice, kiyodama, lava rock, Fuji grit. There's a whole raft of soils that we use. And a lot of them are designed to give the tree the best water retention capacity, good drainage though, but good aeration. So for example, sort of kiryu provides you with the drainage and aeration, whereas an akadama actually is a really nice hard-baked clay, and it actually allows for a level of sort of nutrient retention, but not excessive. And so you don't get a build-up of sort of nutrients in the actual pot. It allows them to flush through, but you then need to keep feeding your trees. And hence it's the ongoing process of feeding, watering, that actually helps the trees to develop healthier roots as well as healthier canopies. And transferring that across, I've used it in specialized planting pits. And I've also used it to aid where you've had root damage through root trenching, and you use a soil like a kanuma, and it's an amazing soil to help actually create those fibrous roots. And just a few examples of the different soils, and they are available in the UK now, and most of them do come from Japan, but you can buy them quite freely in the UK. I've experimented with the different soils, and one of the things we found with the pines when we were experimenting with different cultivars and growing pines was that actually they really struggle in a lot of our UK soils. And we found that putting them in a pure pumice soil was one way to actually get amazing growth, really good colour, good vigour. And it was down to the drainage, that free aeration and drainage within the soil, as well as the ability for pines that they create mycorrhiza freely, which is brilliant. And the growth rate now on some of the pines that we've got in pure pumice is phenomenal, which then allows you, because they're really healthy, to then be able to be sort of decandled to help promote with the pruning. And it's just a really good substance to use. A few of the others, some of these different species, you use different soils for the different species. Like azalea, you tend to put in a kanuma soil because it's slightly acidic, whereas sort of like a ginkgo, I would put in an akadama with a small mix of kiryu. And that's the really sort of enjoyment of actually creating your own soil mixes and working out what works for different species, and then the results by your canopy and how good your roots are of the trees. So in terms of, I developed the Styrex japonica to have a fantastic fibrous root system through just purely the soil medium that you were growing it in, and the same with the mountain maple. Really good response to the sort of the sort of fibrous root development that you're looking for bonsai to support the tree, because at the end of the day it only has a small soil volume. They're kept in quite restricted small pots, and the whole idea is that you keep improving those roots over the lifespan of the tree. So often you'll start with a bonsai that doesn't have a very good root system, and the idea of part of the hobby is to actually develop that root system and get the structure, get the style, get the sort of shape, layer the roots where you want, create different types of root, so you've got an amazing fibrous root pad for moisture and nutrient uptake. And the ginkgo in the photo is early days. That's a sort of a very sort of starter tree. stump literally, that it would need a lot more work, probably 2 to 3 years of root development, if not longer, to improve that, to get a better fibrous root system. So in terms of all the different techniques that we're using, so root pruning, so some species you'll annually root prune, others you might do on a sort of 3 to 5 year regime, depending on the species. But you're looking to modify the roots to be the most functioning system within the pot. And one of the things with bonsai is that nearly every bonsai you'll come across, hopefully, should be wired into the pot. So this means that the tree doesn't need to put out structural roots. It can focus on its fibrous roots because it's secured in the pot in the first place. And with root pruning, you get a chance to take the tree out the pot, observe its roots, check for any pests and diseases, and really understand what's going on with your tree's rooting system, which in arboriculture and looking after big trees, it's very rare that you can ever get to really explore the roots of a large tree. And transferring some of those techniques into growing trees and into arboricultural practices in nurseries is a really good way of making those two connections. And the amount of feeding that you can do to help develop roots with different types of hormones and different nutrients is a really good way of expanding how a tree actually grows. So trees in nature, they sort their own roots out, but there are certain things that in nursery practices we can do to help improve that. So again, removing any roots that are sort of girdling or crossing, those sorts of things, and just making sure that when you buy trees, that you buy trees with really sort of good roots to start with, because if you're planting them out and you're not ever going to lift them out the ground again, they need that stable root system to start with. And with the ginkgos that I was playing with bonsai, you get to sort of look at the different responses of how trees push out roots and the different types of roots they push out. And it's actually quite fascinating when you actually put different layers and graduated soils within a pot, and the size of roots you get from actually sort of a larger granule at the bottom, you get much fatter, sort of more water root. And then at the top, you get your more fibrous root in the sort of more finer grade material. And it was just fascinating being able to observe that up close and see a really healthy root system, because it was enjoying the actual soil medium that you're growing it in. The other sort of fascinating thing I found with different sort of species is that some will push aerial roots really quickly and easily and others don't. And I was noticing that also with the larger trees. So looking at London planes, they often had aerial roots within sort of bark unions and old cavities. And it's another way of actually, you can use the aerial areas and actually then a second tree out of one turned into two, but you can also fuse them to the trunk to help thicken the trunk for bonsai development. So it's, again, amazing to study that up close. Tree root development we do where you actually sort of space out the roots. You can use guys, we can use sort of slate underneath to try and get a flat root plate. Less transferable to perhaps arboriculture, but still really nice to sort of have that beautiful, what we call nabari, on your finished bonsai. You're trying to create that really old look of an established root system. And that's sort of partly some of the techniques we're using throughout bonsai. And one of the absolute joys was when you get your first fungi pop up in your bonsai. And it's like, I was so keen to explore what they were. So I took one of these bonsais across to Alice Holt and actually came up with sort of getting a keyed out sort of definitive guide. And this one had an ectomycorrhizal fungus, which again shows that it's really quite happy and healthy with a really good sort of root system. And with pines, as I said earlier, they develop an amazing sort of root system. And it's just, again, changes your technique for when you repot, that you can't just literally do what you would do with a broadleaf. You have to think about how to sort of rework those roots and sort of do your annual, or probably 3 yearly repot, where you take out slices of a root system. But again, each of your repotting is very specific to each tree that you own, because it's depending on how advanced that tree is, how advanced its root development is, to how much root work you need to do. And we've observed that actually a lot of the roots on a pine that's established have actually nearly all sort of not rotted away, but actually sort of have a sort of coexisting function with the mycorrhiza so much that it's hard to distinguish where the mycorrhiza fungus starts and where the roots sort of end, really. Crown development has been another fascination that I've moved very heavily across into my arboricultural day-to-day, where we're looking at the different techniques in bonsai, from defoliation to reduction pruning to leaf stripping, all the different techniques that you use, to then transferring that to your bonsai your arboricultural specifications for things like crown reductions, and your post aftercare pruning, where you actually do extra irrigation with perhaps a liquid feed. So I'm starting to feed sort of some of the mature trees that you've perhaps done a crown reduction on with a liquid feed of seaweed. So this was a lovely big oak that we had to reduce. It was outgrowing its available space. And in terms of how it looks, some people will say it's too contrived, but actually the regrowth on it now, and I saw it actually yesterday, and I was going to put in a photo, is just phenomenal. It's filled in all of those gaps, and its crown is rejuvenated and denser than it was previously, which is fantastic. And how that relates when you compare the two pictures with bonsai, and you're looking at sort of, this is a fairly established, about 80 to 100-year-old Korean hornbeam, which is exhibited, or was exhibited quite often at Chelsea, and grown by a good friend in Swindon Bonsai called Reg Bolton. And it's a phenomenal tree. And it's designed to look like an open-grown, field-grown tree in the landscape, but in a small bonsai form. And not that it's that small, it's a fairly sort of sizable bonsai, but they're basically, the techniques that you're using are sort of doing crown reductions, you're doing leaf pruning, you're doing thinnings, and it's sharing those two different sets of techniques on different scales, which is brilliant. When you look at sort of trees, again, bonsai particularly without their leaves, you'll see the intense amount of twiggery and the really healthy canopy. It's about the number of leaves that replace the size of leaf. So you've still got the same density of leaf area, but you've just got it in miniature, and you've got it across and along branches, and the overall effect is phenomenal in winter image. And the same, you can do the same exactly with your evergreens, with different techniques from decandling to needle pruning, to actually then get your sort of real nice pads and structures. And I use the techniques that we use in bonsai again on some of the cedars, especially to try and reduce the amount of wind frost damage that you can get through canopies. And by thinning out cedars, you can actually take out all that dead leaf matter and everything else, and then the snow and everything else falls through the branches much more easily and readily, stopping then that sort of winter wind damage and branch breakout. So my first tree on the left was a lovely Taiwanese fig. And when I was learning, I went through many sort of disasters, I suppose, and this was one of them, I thought. And it was all around sort of me trying to do things too quickly with the tree. So when it originally came to me, it was in quite a deep pot, and I decided I would want it instantly in a shallow pot, and then I was pruning it heavily, and it basically started to die off. And I thought I'd lost it. And then I thought, no, I haven't. I've got all of this skill set. I will be able to recover it. And I had faith in the tree as well. They are so resilient. And I'm happy to say that by 2011, I'd managed to regrow its full canopy back. And it was probably a better shape and form than it had been when I originally purchased it. So it's something that you can sort of recover a bonsai tree that you've got into difficulty with, hopefully. And this was a bit of an embarrassing one, but it was my first journey with bonsai. And again, transferring the techniques, knowing that sort of crown reduction and pruning regimes helps rejuvenate trees. We had another estate I was looking after, some really problematic sort of dying sort of and declining oaks. And this one particularly had Illinois dryadius, which isn't too much of a problem, but the top was starting to decline and we were getting branch failure. So one of the options was to actually reduce it down to like a monolith, and we left the lower regrowth, but what it's done now, it's phenomenal. It's redeveloped a lovely canopy. It will never be how it was originally, but we've managed to get that beautiful canopy back to sort of up to a point. So it's still a beautiful feature in the landscape. And moving on from bonsai and sort of into garden techniques and garden trees, I started also with the hobby of Nowaki and had some really good experiences. And I've tried these out in my front garden. So I was playing with a Persian ironwood, and I've been developing it for a few years now. And Niwaki is basically a garden tree that's pruned and shaped to fit the size of space that you've got available. And I didn't have a space available enough to get a mature Persian ironwood in my front garden, but I have got a space for it, and I can maintain it at the size. And the growth rate is absolutely phenomenal. The response to pruning, I tend to prune it every sort of 2 to 3 weeks. Once it comes into leaf, I'll do a structure prune in winter as well. And I'm still working on the pad development, but it's brilliant to have a play. And I learned a lot of skills and saw a lot of experiencing of these techniques in Japan, but also from doing workshops with Jake Hobson in the UK. And again, a lot of the techniques are similar to bonsai and transferable for your garden trees. I enjoy also looking at trees in nature, and that links with the bonsai, that you're trying sometimes to create that sort of living image of what you see in nature in your bonsais. And Blenheim is an amazing place to go anyway, but if you want some inspiration for your bonsais, then it's also a fantastic place. And if you can try and style some of your trees on trees in nature, it makes for an even more exciting hobby. The giant redwood that I did earlier, a very good friend, Dan Barton, had already created one, and his is absolutely stunning. It was the sort of image I was looking to create in my original attempt with a giant redwood. And again, having been to the New Forest and seen the tall trees there, that's a sort of, again, links to nature. Got to, again, look at different figs. My other obsession in bonsai at the moment is figs, and sort of the way that they grow, the roots on them are phenomenal. And seeing what they do with their bonsais in places like China is amazing. And the climate is perfect for them. And unfortunately in the UK, it's not quite the same, but you can really see how well they do. And naturally, they just push out roots all over the place. The other thing that you get to sort of have a play with is the different bending shapes and styling. And the potentilla on the left is a lovely little twisted trunk. And it just reminded me of that process of the thigmomorphogenesis that you see in sweet chestnuts and other species of trees. And it's again linking the two and with the different sort of shapes and forms in nature. Talking about tree species and sizes, I know I'm running through time very quickly, but things like the different species I've tried around 80 different species of trees as bonsai, and here's 6 examples of ones I've worked on. So I got an Akiba quinata, the chocolate vine, and literally it was about the size of a pencil when I originally bought it from a garden centre, and developed it into a sort of, not quite yet there, a bonsai. The Styrax japonica, beautiful with those lovely bell-shaped flowers. And the Prunus mume is just something to behold in January when it comes into flower. It's stunning. I enjoyed the swamp cypress, is another good one, but again, that's one that you'll need to really get hold of its root system, because it's a repot every sort of 6 months really. The speed that its roots want to grow, it's brilliant. And then other ones like your more tropical trees, which most people refer to as indoor bonsai, only because they need to stay above 10 degrees, are things like your jaboticas and your figs. And they are fantastic. If you've only got an indoor space, brilliant sort of species to sort of work with. But all the others are all outdoor trees that generally you can grow outdoors all year round with a bit of winter protection. So bonsai trees come in all shapes and sizes. And again, you'll see that in China and in Taiwan, some of their bonsai trees and their exhibition phenomenal. And they're quite dwarfed under some of their trees, fantastic. But they also come in pint size or even smaller, so that when you can actually pick it up with just your fingertips, it's a whole world. But they are just normal species of trees, just kept smaller or kept slightly larger, but in pots with different various techniques. So my message is everyone has space for a tree, whether you've only got a flat, whether you've got a windowsill or a little section outside your house, or you have got a garden, you've all got space for trees. And I think we should really encourage schools to have more horticultural and arboricultural element from a much earlier age. And I was privileged to go to a primary school in China. This was exactly what was happening. So without further ado, quick summary: glean knowledge from everywhere possible, be inspired to try new things, have a go yourself, enjoy the learning process, take time to study and observe, talk and share with everybody from other disciplines, and most importantly, make connections and think outside the box. So that's me, John.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I enjoyed that. Bonsai in schools is an awesome idea, and there's a few people loving the word twiggery. So that's very, very popular. Brilliant. Okay, so keep submitting your questions for Amelia. We've got quite a few in already, but right away we're going to go over to Rob for something completely different. Rob, it's my pleasure to bring you to the stage as well. Please share your screen. It's over to you. Thank you. Well done, Amelia.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I want to thank the Arboricultural Association for having the really brilliant idea of doing these international webinars. And Amelia, your presentation was super. And that's just so beautiful, and the way you blend it all together. And of course, the fact that everybody can have a tree, even if it has to be in a teacup in a little apartment, you can still have trees. That's just, I can't even express how happy I was to listen to you talk. But what the Arboricultural Association is doing is really fantastic. It's very important for all of us today to be able to talk to one another, whether we're professionals, scientists, or tree lovers. You know, I've watched the last 3 webinars and they've been tremendous. I've learned a great deal by watching them. I can't overstate how wonderful this is. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch here. Do this. This is my, excuse me, I'm going to back up just a second. I just wanted to say that the goal of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of current ecological thinking about urban forestry and illustrate some of the opportunities for the use of current ecological science in decision making in 3 operational scales. And that is at the regional ecosystem landscape scale, within parks and private home sites, and then finally looking at planting sites. Realize that a scientific discussion of urban forestry is complicated because urban forestry is a hybrid endeavor. On one hand, it's a scientific discipline, albeit a relatively new one, grounded in ecological science. And on the other hand, it's an expression of the values of people who are involved in mandating and shaping and opposing and practicing it. This presentation will focus on how applied ecology grounds the practice. But the hybrid nature of this emerging discipline is always in the background. Urban forestry is both science-based and value-driven. I'll give a couple of extreme examples of the older approach to urban tree and park management and its shortcomings, with the hope that those shortcomings indicate what needs to be incorporated into the new discipline of urban forest conservation and management. This was my home when I was a teenager. This is Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, New York City. As I was mentioning to Amelia and John and Sophie before, you're looking straight down Nostrand Avenue. This used to be a stream valley. This is the logical outcome of the prevailing attitude towards the environment in my country, and I believe in much of the rest of the world today. Simply that it's a resource to be exploited for maximum human benefit in the shortest possible time. It is treating the land as a commodity only. In this, we are fostering an autistic relationship between our rapidly expanding human society, now centered in cities, and the land and the water that support human society and their ability to live within these highly densified urban zones. These are serious problems. A commodity-based perception of land and life, and an autistic relationship between much of human society and the rest of the living world. These are serious problems because during the next 25 years, we will design and establish the living environment for almost half of the human population. So where do we begin to manage the emerging urban forest? We can begin by placing it in its historic context. And of course, that's going to depend upon which part of the world you're in and how you view that historic context. Here, where I live in the eastern United States, we're looking at an area that I worked in, Maryland. And those arrows are pointing at Loch Raven Reservoir, which was built in 1890. And this map shows you a computerized expression of land use change from 1890 to 1992, the bright yellow being the urban part, the truly urban, the city part. And you can see that in 1890, the reservoir, Loch Raven Reservoir that is, the reservoir that provides clean drinking water for 3 million people, was designed to be well outside the city. It's surrounded by about 6,000 acres of forest and was intended to be in the country where the natural systems could support the cleansing of water and providing a clear system for human use. But in 102 years, it has completely changed. We get down to 1992, we can see where Loch Raven Reservoir is now, and I can tell you that it's surrounded on 3/4 of its perimeter by townhouses. This is the emerging urban forest, not just what's in the yellow, but what's outside the yellow also, because the people inside that city and their economic systems and their social values are now imposing their value system across the entire countryside. So integrating management into the regional landscape and recognizing the ecological processes that are being affected by social values and economic norms is important in making our management decisions. I want to point out just very quickly that from 102 years for a common tree in this area, a white oak, Quercus alba, only brings it up to its sexual maturity. That is, to the point that the tree is actually reproducing enough acorns to support the continued existence of its species. This brings up, then the white oak, of course, has a 200 to 300 year life range, even if we don't talk about retrenchment and all the other aspects of the aging of trees. A question I pose to you is, do we have, as professionals, as scientists, as people who are lovers of trees and forests, do we have a responsibility to the landscape, or only to those who own or occupy it? The ones we often call clients or users. I'm going to suggest to you that we have an ethical responsibility for intergenerational management and consideration, especially now in our growing urban world, in the Anthropocene. Land is now too precious to be wasteful, and we need to begin to consider that each parcel of land, each part of our landscape, each part of the surface of the terrestrial part of our globe is likely to need care and to be considered for its multiple uses and multiple values. An ecological conversation has begun in earnest. You're looking at a generalized graph of some work that I did with the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States and my group, the Tampa Bay Watershed Forest Working Group. And we did an analysis of ecosystem services and goods. Now, I want to tell you that this is not iTree. iTree does a great job generally with air relationships and the canopy, but this is actually comes from models that were developed with the Environmental Protection Agency specific to the west central part of Florida, which is where Tampa Bay is. And you can see the forest provides the greatest number of benefits in all categories, followed closely behind by wetlands. The conversation has begun, but it's just the beginning of the conversation, because now we can begin to express the values that the forest has for human population. But now it is up to you and I to begin to actualize it. We have a large part in how it will be actualized, and that'll take knowledge, skill, and courage, and a good bit of humility. We can start by evaluating our projects from an ecological perspective and adapting existing practices and strategies from that new perspective. We can also begin to involve all populations in the identification and integration of ecological needs of the landscape itself with human needs. Urban forestry is a response to the emergence of the Anthropocene during the early and latter parts of the 20th century. This context that we're in is unprecedented, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty going on here. A lot of uncertainty for us as professionals in the disciplines associated with urban forestry, but a great deal of uncertainty for other professionals and for other people. The touchstone, of course, is the ecological principles that undergird our practice. They should guide the development and the implementation of urban forestry. We need to be, for instance, much better at monitoring our conservation actions. Long-term monitoring helps us to identify defensible relationships between our management actions and outcomes. It allows us to adjust technical practices and management actions over time as changes occur both within the physical, biological environment and in the expectation of the residents for whom we typically work. Few activities are more important to the success of urban forest management and conservation than monitoring. But this step is often overlooked, poorly designed, underfunded, or simply not funded at all. So I go back to some of those examples of what's happened. You know, what's wrong? And as my friend Michael often says, we need to zoom out and zoom in to see what's going on ecologically. Perhaps the best way to indicate the shortcomings of the first generation of urban forest conservation is to state the assumptions, the ecological assumptions. These were the same assumptions that had dominated ecology as a whole since its inception in the late 1800s, but that were increasingly beginning to give way through the 1970s with the explosion of human populations and our technical ability to monitor the whole Earth systems and their change. This is partly what we couldn't do before. The old ecological paradigm that was the basis for our management for terrestrial, aquatic systems, and then as we began to grow our urban areas, our urban systems, that old ecological paradigm suggested that ecosystems were closed, that they were discrete, that each patch of the landscape could be managed separately, that each patch itself was self-regulating, that each patch moved toward a stable equilibrium. It was assumed that that movement towards that static or stable equilibrium was deterministic and strictly predictable, that disturbed states in nature were thought to be the exception, and humans were not really components of ecological systems. They were some type of alien disturbance. This is logical that these assumptions were such, because much of the literature, even today, that we read, or in our schools, that our children read even today, comes from studies that were undertaken far, far from human settlements. They undergird the idea of a balance of nature. How often do we hear the balance of nature, right? When we hear the balance of nature, we should all back up a little bit, because this old paradigm is alive and thriving in my own home state of Florida, which your image now illustrates. This is a regional example of a regional landscape, okay? The same government agencies that established the 1,200 hectare, 3,000 acre protected area for rare and threatened endemic plants and species, as you see on the bottom half of this image, approved the design and placement of the residential development on the top portion of your image, the northern portion. Before the development occurred, this landscape was completely the same. What has occurred is a completely engineered redesign of the landscape. But what has occurred also is that redesign of the landscape for human habitation has changed the hydrology, has changed the availability of plants and animals, and is now affecting the very ecological character of that 1,200 hectare area to support globally rare and threatened endemic plants and animals. Not only that, the presence of the human population there, right up against the border of that nature preserve, precludes the use of fire on this nature preserve, which is very important because most of these plants and animals work and live within fire-dependent types of communities. An ecological approach to urban forest management is going to require that we shift our focus from just trees, not that that's not important, but from just trees to trees, woodlands, and forests within entire metropolitan ecosystems or regions or watersheds. The contemporary ecological perspective of ecosystems, that is, the perspective on ecosystems held today by science, is that ecosystems can be open. They can be externally regulated. For instance, where I live, lots of hurricanes. So, the forests, whether it's municipal forest or it's forest in the traditional sense that we think, are absolutely regulated by hurricanes. Today, wind is bringing soil over from the Sahara. It's going to affect our climate. It's also going to affect the amount of solar radiation that comes in, and it may, in fact, cover up some of the plants with dust. That these ecosystems themselves have probabilistic dynamics and multiple trajectories, right? That there is no deterministic pre-existing line in which a community reorganizes itself. These communities are plant communities and their animal associations are and can be affected by natural disturbance, and that they include people, that people are part of the ecosystem. For so long, we talked about people as if they were some alien disturbance regime. But in fact, in the land that I live in Florida, we have ample evidence that people have been living here easily for over 20,000 years. They used fire to shape the landscape. The landscape that the European settlers found was, in fact, an expression of that use. This is a contemporary perspective that suggests the world is not static. It actually is in a state of flux. This is a concept called contingency, that nothing is static, that the specific dynamics of any one system that we can look at is contingent upon its history, the accidents of arrival of species on the site, and the nature of the system's connection to the surrounding landscape. For instance, the Hillsborough River that runs through the city of Tampa. When we remove the forest from the first and second order streams way up in the watershed, we increase greatly the flash flows of water, and we create flooding down in the city of Tampa. So let's take a look and zoom out and zoom in a little bit more in our urban and urbanizing forest. This is an area about 10 miles or less outside what you and I would typically have considered the city of forest, the municipal boundaries. This is a rapidly urbanizing portion of the Tampa Bay watershed or metropolitan region. We're looking at a river on the right-hand side, that's the Alafai River. And in the bullseye I've created is a small group of houses. They're not very big. The houses themselves are about 900 square feet. I'm sorry, I'm not great translating that into metrics. But the arrows, what I'm suggesting is that what's happening inside this little neighborhood is affecting what's happening outside. And in fact, what's happening outside is affecting what's going on inside ecologically and socially. So I'm going to pick out one of these houses, okay? This is a single family home. It's got maybe 84, 85 square meter house. The land holding itself is about 560 square meters, not very big, okay? Not very big. But on this one property, there are 97 species of native plants. 43 species of vertebrate animals use it, and 34 species of invertebrates use it. I'm going to back out a little bit, let you think about that again, and think about that. That one little place provides habitat for almost 100 species of native plants, 43 species of native vertebrates, and 34 species of invertebrates. It's playing a significant role. How do we, as arborists, as urban foresters, relate to this? Well, first off, I have to say to you that one of the major things we need to do is, again, thinking about the design of these emerging urban forests and ensuring that we can maintain these ecological connections and functionalities. So we have to make sure that we keep the connections alive. And that's what the arrows are all about. This area that they're in is actually what's called a remnant sand live oak community. It's not very rare, but the oaks are still there. And the people who are living there, in some cases, like the people who live in this particular place, are attempting to keep it viable, keep it open, keep access available, and to support the native plant community that exists there. So zoom out again. We'll zoom out and take a peek at the city of Tampa. This is a neighborhood in the city of Tampa called Ybor. And we're going to go right into that bullseye there. That's going to take us down to a retirement home. And that retirement home was built about 100 years ago. And they were looking to expand that back area to have better parking. And so they applied to the city of Tampa to take out some trees and to build a parking lot. This is what the city of Tampa found. This tree is just recently discovered, of course, by the program. They wanted to cut it down to build a parking lot. The tree is estimated to be between 350 to 500 years old, making it perhaps the oldest tree still standing in the region and predating the city of Tampa by as much as 300 years. The person you're seeing in the photograph, the woman, her name is Kathy Beck. She's my good friend, and she's been an arborist for 40 years. And at the time, she was the supervisor of natural resources. She defied the planning department and refused the permit to remove the tree. When lawyers for the landowners and the city government got involved, she began proceedings to have the entire site placed into the National Historic Registry. She was courageous. She was courageous. People did not understand the ecological value, the legacy that this tree, and in fact this site, provides. Remember that the site itself has not been disturbed for over 100 years. And in fact, when Kathy and I first went out there, we found several different trees going through the process of retrenchment. And of course, this one really stands out just because it's so huge and magnificent. It took courage. She was threatened with losing her job, but she stood by it, and the tree is still there. This is what's going on in our urbanizing regions, is that these little pockets of natural areas, whether that's that 1,200 hectare area that we saw, I showed you earlier, or whether it's this small 4 hectare area, are becoming encased in urban zones. And we are becoming the managers of this type of urban forest also. So I want to take a look one more time into a different site level, and that is planting a tree. All right, this is something very fundamental activity we get into. So what do? We go out and inspect the site. We look at the physical ground above and below to see if there's obstacles for growth and longevity. We test the soil to determine pH, look for contaminants perhaps, and we choose the species that best suited for the site. Right tree, right place. There may be several trees that could be fit into that right tree, right place. Does it matter if it's native or non-native? Yeah, you bet. You bet it does ecologically. In my country, 96% of all the terrestrial birds rely on the availability of insects to feed their young. Pound for pound, they provide more protein than beef or anything of high value in terms of energy. My friend Doug Tallamy up at the University of Delaware looked at trees and ranked them by their ability to support the family Lepidoptera, which are basically the moths and butterflies. Again, a species of wildlife, fauna, that many people in our urbanizing world really appreciate having around. This is what he found. I don't need to read them to you, but I can tell you that it's the pupae from these Lepidoptera that provide most of the food for the nestlings and the fledglings of the songbirds that exist in North America. Also, a type of animal, bird, songbirds, that provide enormous value to our urbanizing population. Let's take a look also what he found in terms of naturalization. We often talk about species coming in that are not native, and people say, well, they naturalize. Well, do they naturalize? Nah, not really. Not really at all. I mean, look at the eucalyptus tree. 48 species of herbivores it supports in its homeland. In North America, 1, after 100 years. Look at the Melaleuca, 409 species it supports in its homeland. In North America, it's been here for 120 years. It only supports 8. There are reasons for this, and that's because the insects themselves have co-evolved with the tree species of the region, and their mouth parts and their digestive parts can only use the species of trees vegetation that they co-evolved with. So last bit, as we're getting up towards the end of my talk here, is that human society has no established history of providing for the continuing health and viability of ecosystems. We should never forget that urban forest conservation and management is and will continue to be essentially a social endeavor. 81% of US residents live in urban areas. They still believe in the balance of nature, which has nothing to do with ecology today. They still believe in the endless resources that can be exploited to serve our human needs and desires, and that the land is a commodity to be bought and sold for the highest price, and that none of this directly is related to their health and well-being. Let's not forget to look critically at our own professional standards and procedures that have also been developed with an old ecological paradigm of closed systems, of human exclusion, of deterministic and steady state ecologies that have more to do with physics and engineering than have to do with ecology. We need, as arborists, as foresters, as designers, and landscape architects, to step up from behind, to stop trying to maintain or fit the natural world into the sanitary cities that are now being produced, and to lead our people into a more holistic relationship with the natural world. The sanitary city of the 1900s, which was developed through the engineering professions, profoundly affects where we are today. What they did in the late 19th century and early 20th century in designing all of the engineering systems for the built environment and the city was absolutely majestic and was needed based upon the epidemics that we were facing in the 19th century. But this paradigm simply cannot be used to create these enormous metropolitan regions that we are developing today. When ecological phenomenon and the social values are attached, the target of sustainability emerges. The goal of conservation under a set of social values that recognizes the importance of the ongoing adjustment, not the static build of the natural component of ecological systems, is sustainability. Sustainability of the processes that produce the resources, the beauty, and all the rest that we are dependent upon. Conservation sits at the crucible of understanding the relationships between societal values and the need for the continuation of those ecological processes. Urban forestry is a conversation between the biophysical world and social values, carried out in the language of ecological processes. It's a hard but rewarding dialogue, and its focal point, it is the focal point of urban forest discipline today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was absolutely brilliant, as always. Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, brilliant. I hope you all enjoyed those presentations. Like I say, two very different topics and equally fascinating. We've got lots of questions in. Now, Amelia, you've been very keen, haven't you?
Sorry.
Quite all right. Nobody's allowed to look at the question and answer panel anymore because Amelia's answered most of the brilliant questions that came in, which is very keen and very welcome, but I'm going to ask some of them anyway.
Sorry.
Because some people won't be looking at the question and answers. Don't say sorry, it's fine, it's good. So one question for Amelia, that I've now just lost. Looking at some of your photographs, a question from Lee. Looking at some of your photographs, the soil looks very much like a miniature version of structural soil that's starting to become widely used. Have you tried mimicking the bonsai soil with street trees?
So in answer to that, I have on a very small scale. But one of the reasons I haven't previously is it was quite hard a while ago to get hold of the sort of volume of the sort of specialised soils that are now more freely available in the UK from bonsai suppliers. And it's also, there's always a cost benefit, I suppose, that you wouldn't use it in every situation. You would try and use the specialised soils that we use in bonsai for that one-off sort of damaged trench of a really important tree. It would be nice if you could use it more widely, but at the moment the cost per bag for a 14 litre, for example, bag of Akadama is about sort of 15 to 17 pounds. So you're looking at a very unrealistic cost benefit, I suppose, for use in everyday life. But we are seeing a huge push in the tree planting pit designs and the use of structural soils. And I'm just hoping to try and get people to make those connections, to look across at the bonsai soils that we use, because they are fantastic mediums for root development.
Interesting. I think we'll be covering some structural soils and tree pit design in Arborist Question Time next week as well. So we might try and raise that with some of our panelists. Rob, there's a question for you from an anonymous attendee, but we'll ask it anyway. Can you recommend some ways in which the public can show their local government that they want more nature in their urban areas?
Yeah, and I suppose they really can use some help. What I can tell you that what I do, I spend a great deal of time with local governments and state governments developing strategies for urban forest conservation. And the first thing we do is conduct social surveys. And that's the best way, because then you're not going out and just giving somebody your individual opinion. You are actually using science-based social surveys to show that there is some level of consensus within your community that they really want this to happen. And that's important primarily because, and this is a question about government decisions, is because, at least in my country and in many countries, we have some form of a democracy. And the people in that democracy need to get elected. And no matter what we think about them, to get elected the next time, they have to represent the consensus of the people that they represent. So if you begin to show them truly scientifically based, in other words, well-established social surveys, they begin to recognize that they need to pay attention to this if they intend to get elected. And I think that's very important. And we, as professionals, can help them do this. And I would suggest that we as people within universities are particularly set up to do that, because we have access to the expertise for people who can do social surveys in a scientific and a defensible manner.
I might ask you about social values in a minute as well, because I know I found that quite inspirational when we first started talking a few years ago, but we'll look at if we can move on to that in a minute. Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Amelia, somebody's asked, first of all, this is just random. Can we make the presentation available to participants? This is a recorded presentation that will be put on our website afterwards, and I'm sure the presenters will be able to make anything available to you that you like. Feel free to email me, john@trees.org.uk, and I'll make sure you get sent the relevant things you want. So that's a general one. Amelia, this one's been texted to me, so I know you haven't seen this one yet. This is from Stuart in Whitminster. How much to get started in bonsai? What's the cost for the first couple of trees?
So the cost is literally, if you buy a packet of seeds, you could start your first bonsai tree. Otherwise, you can go and collect from an approved site, or go and dig up a sapling from in your garden. Another way is actually to sort of go and buy one of the sort of conventional ones from a bonsai trader, and you can pick up a reasonable little tree. I can give you a demonstration. So a little sort of Taiwanese fig, very reasonable price. You could probably sort of purchase one of those for less than £25. And again, the cost of the pot that you keep them in actually can be more valuable than the trees. A lot of friends have a real passion for the pots that bonsais are kept in, and some of their pots are worth hundreds of pounds. One of the things I've loved with the hobby as well is you actually get to make your own pots. So we have like bonsai potting sort of workshops where Walsall Studio Ceramics come down and do a workshop with us, and they'll show us how to make our own bonsai pots. And so if you're really creative, you can actually make your own pot. And the best pot sort of material to keep bonsai in is a ceramic. So rather than plastic, but you can start them out in a training plastic pot. So Bonsai doesn't have to be an expensive hobby, but if you're looking for a really impressive, ready-made, mature tree, then you would be looking to spend a lot more money. But just to get off the ground, grow your own, have a go with some seeds to start with, or otherwise just a few saplings, go to a garden centre and just buy a normal tree or shrub and learn the bonsai techniques as you go by converting it from a normal garden centre piece of material into a bonsai. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, good news, Stu. All you need is some seeds in a pot, and that's your person taken care of. Another question from Stu, actually, for Rob. Is the public understanding of the ecological pressures we face growing in the USA now?
That's a good question, John. And I think that it is, but I still believe that we don't understand the ecological implications of what we are doing. And I say that for the US, but I don't see it anywhere in the world. I see people reacting to the deterioration of the climate. I see people reacting to the loss of a woodland. I don't see positive, constructive conversation. I don't see attempts to take our best knowledge, which is a knowledge of relationships and ecological systems in the design of our cities. In 25 years, we will have designed and implemented and built the living environment for half of the human population. This is what needs to be done. Maintenance is important, and I'm not disagreeing with that. You can build what you want, and if you don't maintain it, that's not good, okay? But constantly reacting to a paradigm of knowledge and techniques that has led to the situation that we're in isn't going to work. Waiting for science to come up with some magic bullet, there's no time for that. You have enough science. We have enough techniques. We have enough technology. What we don't have is the will to change. If we have the will to change, and I mean that professionally also, all of us as professionals, to change the way we approach what we do, that's going to make the difference. In my country, that will happen, and around the world, that will happen when the values of the people are aligned more closely with the recognition that we need a mutually enhancing relationship between human society and the rest of the living world. It's a very fundamental question. And if that changes, then the economic systems will change also. And life itself won't be just a commodity that we buy and sell. So in the United States, it was a long-winded answer, I know, but you asked a big question. Is it changing? Yeah, it's changing. But that's where we all need to be as professionals too, in that conversation, in ensuring that that whole old conversation of the balance of nature, which we still teach our children in elementary school and in secondary schools and even in some colleges, is not relevant. It does not exist. So we need a lot of education.
Just as a quick, well, probably won't be quick, but just a little supplementary. Are there any, and it won't be quick in a good way, I know you. Are there any countries around the world you think are sort of leading the way in that respect, in recognizing and addressing the problems, the challenges we face?
Well, I find it ironic that so many people look to the United States for it. Mm-hmm. And if we are the leaders, then wow. Okay? But one thing I can tell you, and the one thing that's very brilliant about what you're doing is that the knowledge to do this is not concentrated in some place. It is collectively in all of the experience of all of us who are listening. I'm a forester. That's what I am. Some of you may have different ideas of what foresters are. Okay? Obviously, probably pretty much not a typical one from what I hear from most people. But what I learned about ecology and ecosystems, I learned in the US, I'm not an arborist. And then I read a paper by Neville Fay. And then I read a couple of other papers by some people over in the UK. And then I said, you know what? These people know something about ecology. They just know it at a different scale. We all have knowledge to share, and we need to be humble about it and suck in as much as we can from everybody else.
Absolutely. I recommend everybody read something by Neville Fay as well, because the guy's brilliant. Small plug for Neville there. Thank you, Rob. Quick comment here from Tim. Thanks, Tim. Tim says garden centres often have an area for damaged trees which are sold cheaper and can be bought to either practice with or train into bonsai for not a great cost. So get down and support your local garden centre and buy their damaged trees. I don't normally say go and buy damaged trees, but Tim, I like it. Okay, now Amelia, you mentioned one thing that set some alarm bells ringing for me, and I thought we'd have some questions about it, and we did. This is a question from Patrick, but I think there's been a couple. About the wound sealant and using the putty on the wounds that you create when you're doing bonsai. Are you suggesting that arborists use wound sealants for routine tree pruning work? Is this a practice used in arboriculture in Japan? And is it something that you use on your ironwood when Nowaki pruning? Great word, Nowaki, by the way. So yeah, wound sealant, are you recommending it used more broadly outside of bonsai?
So not for everyday pruning works. It's just not physically and feasible and practicable as a tree surgeon to do that. But if you're working on particular species that are more prone, or you're worried about infection, if you're working on a historic tree, for example, where you're trying to reduce the impact of transferable pathogens and everything else, then if you're taking off a large wound and you want it to actually occlude well, then I would suggest and promote the use of them, but only in specific cases, and more so promoting the use when you've got a vandalized tree, or you've got sort of a way of actually sort of, if you've got to do a trench and you know you're going to be causing a large root wound, or you're having to, like I was, having to remove a wall that the tree had abutted up against and hadn't actually put out bark itself, that you can use the putty and the paste as a way of protecting that bark from the elements so the moisture isn't lost. And in response to Patrick around whether I use it for Nowaki, when I was doing the large sort of structural pruning on the Persian ironwood, I don't use it on all the day-to-day sort of fortnightly pruning. I'd be there for hours. But on the larger wounds, when I'm taking off sort of the size of sort of a sort of, I don't know, sort of 20 centimeter diameter, that sort of thing, because it's such a small tree, I would try and use it, yes.
Interesting, thank you very much. Rob, do you wound painting or the similar, is that used much in Florida and Tampa?
No, actually it's not, and I found that very interesting also. As a matter of fact, some of the papers that I've read suggest the opposite, and you were saying that they did exist. I know that you said that. So I was very curious, so I may write to you in a couple of days and ask you about that. But around here, it's standard operating procedure that you don't use any type of sealant on in an arboricultural sense.
And I think that one of the things that's crucial and coming out in sort of the current sort of trend around biosecurity now is the importance of sterilizing your tools between trees, cleaning tools and everything else. And it's something we've always done in bonsai. So once you finish pruning one tree, you clean your tools before you move on to the next one, because it's so easy on such a small scale to transfer diseases, pests and everything else. And it's, again, trying to push that message out in terms of the biosecurity and everything on larger trees. Like Masari is a very classic for transference from one tree to another with London plane, and trying to encourage more people. I know it's a difficult time when you've got a lot of trees to work on, and chainsaws and larger tree surgery equipment is not the most easiest to clean and sterilize, but it's just so crucial to try and use some of the techniques and transfer a few of the approaches, but whole scale, it's very difficult. I can appreciate that.
Brilliant, thank you both. Right, we promised big ideas, and we've got a big question here. Rob, I'm going to aim this at you, but Amelia, I'm sending it your way afterwards. It's a question from Robert Knott. Rob, do you feel that the economic structure of the Western world is the sole reason for the lack of want to put ecology at the forefront of urban management?
Say that one more time, buddy.
Do you feel that it's the economic structure of the Western world that is the main or the only reason for the fact that we're not putting ecology at the forefront of urban management and development?
That's a big question.
It is.
I can tell you that if you put an economic value on a living organism, that when that value is used to represent that living organism within an economic system, that living organism will lose every time. It cannot compete with the interest rates of an economic system. It's an interesting question, also because one of my colleagues, Dave Nowak, of course, created iTree, which many people are using, and it's a fantastic system, and it is helping us to have this conversation today. It puts economic values on life. Be wary of that, my friends. Be wary of putting economic values on life. It is not the place to have this conversation. It is not the context in which to make decisions about what lives and what dies, who suffers and who prospers. These are bigger conversations than that. So, but I do want to, with that said, I do want to acknowledge from the previous question, John, just real quick, were things changing in the United States? And I have to give a shout out again to Dave Nowak and say that, yes, the conversation has expanded greatly. It has expanded greatly. Is it changing the way things are being done? No, because we're still having that conversation within an economic context. And so the people with the money, the people who can make the decisions, that includes you and I, by the way. I don't absolve myself from that. We are making decisions that are tearing down ecological relationships, that are building up ecological debt in the end, that we will have to deal with. Part of that we're dealing with today. I'm sick 12 weeks inside my house because of the pandemic. Do I think it's solely the economic system of the Western world? No. All major religions in this world point to three things that are problems: greed, power, and arrogance. That's the three-headed monster.
Amelia.
Those are the problems, John.
I feel like you're just, I'm not that bad, but you're right, yeah. No. Amelia, what do you think? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think from my time, and it was only a short 8 weeks, but from my time in Japan and also from my time in China, I think culturally, one of the things I appreciated in both countries was their intrinsic appreciation of nature, ecology, beauty, and all things natural. And you went through the countryside and you went through some stunning areas in both Japan and China where nature was celebrated, and you saw examples of that in how people treated trees and plants and flowers and everything in their gardens, through to like a fantastic example of that is celebrating the cherry blossom season in Japan, and the going out as a community, and workplaces go out with lovely sort of setups where you go out and you sit under the cherry blossoms. Tens of thousands of people from just even inside Japan, let alone the millions that come in from elsewhere, that are just there to celebrate the beauty of nature. And I've never seen anything like that replicated anywhere else in the world on that sort of volume and scale, where you go out and part of your requirement in terms of work is to actually go out with your work colleagues and go and sit under the cherry blossom and drink sake and enjoy yourself and celebrate the outdoor world and all its beauty. And so culturally, I think there's a big element that could be more heavily led to how we appreciate nature more. A lot of us, we all love trees. Everybody on this group today, we're all here because we all have the same interests and passion. And the economics of things often blurs that, but I think deep down there is a huge cultural sort of element that we're so detached from nature. I see it even more with the younger generations coming through, that they're not allowed to experience nature in the same way that I was. I was allowed to go out and play in muddy puddles and climb trees, and risk wasn't as significant a factor. And now everybody's afraid of a few falling leaves and debris, and a lot of people have allergies now, which is more significant. So there are so many cultural things that are barriers to the development of that more special cohesion with nature and ecology, that I think economy plays a part, but there is a huge cultural passion that I think we should be trying to explode within people and engaging with communities more.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much, both. Wow, that was a big one. I like that one. Ooh, deep stuff. Okay, right. We've only got time for a couple more questions, I think. So, sort of Amelia's question. We've had a question from Tipu. I think that's how you say Tipu. What are the key points to remember before starting bonsai?
I think the key thing is remember that they are in a container. So whatever you do, you have to make sure that you water them. That's one of the key components, that you have to be available to the tree. It is totally dependent on you, and you can't leave it and go on holiday for a week and then expect it to be alive when you get home. And I think that's the key thing. You have to realize it is a commitment. It's a bit like having a living pet. They are living plants, and therefore they are normal trees, just kept on a small scale. So you need to make sure that you have that ability to either set up an irrigation system or have that time to make sure you can look at them every day and water them. So yes, that's probably my best advice, is to make sure you water your bonsai.
That's good advice. Thank you very much. Okay, so I reckon we've got a couple, there's some great comments coming up in the chat, by the way. Obviously, I recommend everyone listens to what's being said, but really good comments in the chat. So Rob, question from you, and then we'll probably just have one more after that. Another quite a big one, I think, from Pratik. How do we maintain the balance between rapidly growing urbanization and the ecosystem?
How do we? The way we can proceed with this, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very uncertain time. We have entered, and we have been actually in the Anthropocene for quite some time, since the 1980s. We have to take stock, just like any other management system. What do we have? What's going on? Looking at the relationships that exist between all the different parts of our Earth systems. And I'm talking very, very big, and I'll break it back down to a metropolitan region, okay? I live in the Tampa Bay watershed. So what I look at is, it's a metropolitan region. So there's a couple of cities, and then there's all this kind of suburban type stuff out there, right? So if we are trying to conserve biological diversity, how do we do that? How do we create a network of conservation areas that allow the flow of energy and water and species to move around the landscape so that we can keep them. But the thing we have to figure out is how they remain viable and how they continue to function. Our biggest problem is ourselves. We do not understand ecosystems. We will likely never understand ecosystems. They are so complex. There are billions of individuals, living organisms in this world. What we do understand is ourselves. What we do understand are those systems that we have created, political systems, social systems, economic systems. We can change these because we were the creator. We need to change those so that they are more in line with the maintenance of the ecological relationships that exist on the landscape, not the other way around. That's why, as a conservationist, I used to manage forests. And I said, no, somebody has to do this. Somebody has to keep these things alive while we figure this out. But if you really want to solve conservation problems, you have to go deal with the human systems that have created them and to change those human systems.
Amelia, have you got any thoughts on that? The balance between urbanization and protecting or maintaining the ecosystems?
I think from having sort of seen, for working as a local authority tree officer, the pressure on land for everything now, the pressure, even just with COVID-19, that the pressure on people's sort of small back gardens, that their house is now their office, their home life, all of these things are sort of basically scaled up across the country. That I used to work in a borough 20 years ago, and I've gone back in the last 20 years now to see it, and the scale of which it's changed. It's become more urbanized, and it's a rural borough, but the pressure to build and sort of squeeze our landscapes and make our conservation elements sort of pressured, really. Like, nature reserves have to be all things to everybody. They aren't just nature reserves for now the conservation of wildlife and protection of species. They are recreational sites. They're sites for dog walking. They're sites for multiple uses. You think there's 30 or 40 different uses of a public open space now. And the pressure on this is growing more and more as we expand as populations, as communities, and I'm not sure what the solution is, excuse me, apart from, I think, agree with Robert about more collaboration, getting sort of a collection of minds together and sharing advice and ideas and seeing if we can tackle these problems together, but not seeing them as problems, but seeing them as a way to find solutions to the ever-growing and changing demands that we have as people, as we live, and we have so much more sort of leisure and pleasure time than we used to. And it's trying to create those environments to support that and appreciate, like with the previous talks, the importance of those green spaces and the value of those green spaces to our health and well-being, which I think is often underplayed. And I've seen just on my site visits how valuable the public open spaces, the parks, the green spaces are, and when they're designed well and think with people and nature and everything in mind, they can be phenomenal spaces. And I think there is no one quick solution, but it's looking at all of it across the world. You see change everywhere, and there was a sort of a real scary sort of series of programs I'm watching currently about the sort of satellite imagery that shows you the scale of which certain countries are changing and vast tracts of landscape are being lost. But it's a difficult one when you look at it on a global scale, but I believe that we do need to try and sort of jointly work on it together.
Thank you. Okay,
John,
sorry, Rob.
Can I just say one thing, please? Is that we are beginning to have this conversation seriously. The fact that we're on these Zoom meetings right now is an indication that this is a serious conversation. And we are beginning to do some monitoring and looking at what's going on. And what's happening what's happening, as my friend Kathy Beck from Tampa would say, is that we're finally getting a seat at the table, okay? We're finally getting a seat at the table. My friends have something to say. Just getting the seat at the table will not change things. You have to bring in the expertise and the knowledge and the desire to collaborate and to create at the table. We need to be the leaders, because the people who have been the leaders have not had to deal with these natural systems like we have.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, there's one more question I want to ask. I think looking at the chat, there's quite a few people who'd be happy to sit here for hours talking trees and philosophy and ecology, and I could myself, but other people have got homes to go to. This question, another one from Rob Knott. Thanks, Robert. Is targeted at Amelia first, but I'm definitely going to go to Rob with it afterwards. Amelia, do you have any thoughts regarding increasing the general ability of pruning knowledge and skills within arboriculture? My experience is that it's a rather fallow area. Are we not very good at pruning in arboriculture?
Having been a lecturer in arboriculture, the syllabus is very limited, and you only have a very short window of training, and you're trying to sort of encourage students with as much sort of knowledge and everything else, but the core practical element of what you're teaching them is a very short sort of session on using chainsaws and very competent based skills, which is fantastic to get them initially going. But there seems to be a lack in the industry of then the sort of more advanced techniques and follow-up training. And at the moment, I've always seen it as a bit of a training gap. And when you sort of, I know Rob very well, and he's a phenomenal tree surgeon, arborist, and sort of also fellow bonsai enthusiast. And I think that's one of the things that we've discussed at length, is that there doesn't seem to be the advanced pruning that helps young arborists develop their skills and sort of improve on their crown reduction techniques, improve on their sort of pest and disease and tree-eyed and everything else. It's very much about initially getting them competent to go out there and practically work. But the next stage is actually building on that knowledge. And it's starting, there are more and more training courses coming online, and it's really great to see that, but we are still missing some of the advanced arboricultural techniques. And luckily, unfortunately, some of the climbing techniques are really moving down that road with more and more advanced training for the climbing techniques. And I would love to also promote that ash dieback particularly really is a huge skill set level where more knowledge and training needs to go into the young arborists that are going to be having to tackle things like dealing with ash dieback and fracturing out of trees and that sort of thing. So I think there's a huge amount more that we can do to help share our knowledge with all the young arborists coming up through, as well as wider communities, and not just with arborists, but also the householder who wants to go out and practice pruning their own trees to try and maintain their own garden trees, and getting more knowledge to them to make them empowered that they feel they can actually prune their own trees without sort of worrying it's suddenly going to die or it's not going to be right. There isn't a right or a wrong way. Sometimes it's just going out and having a go when you're sort of having a go with Niwaki perhaps, but there aren't many training courses available in the UK for small garden pruning even. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Rob, what's your thoughts from a US perspective?
Well, my observation is that most of the certified arborists, the ISA certified arborists, we'll forget about the rest of them because there's a lot of fly-by-night people who are just out there hacking at trees. But it is that they're following standards, you know, and these standards are very narrow, and so they don't have a broad understanding of how to use the structural manipulation of the tree to gain different outcomes. And I want to suggest, for instance, and I'll just take this back to my talk, was that house that you looked at that had all those trees and all those plants and everything, right? Had all those birds in them too, right? Well, when those birds are nesting and having fledglings, you shouldn't be in there pruning those trees if you can help it. You should be telling these people that, hey, why don't you wait? I'll come back after the breeding season is done, and we'll take care of the birds, you know, and we'll take care of your trees, and we'll take care of the pupae and the butterflies and everything else all along with it. But if you're asking about the practice itself, I've got to say it's pretty rudimentary from my perspective.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'd recommend everyone goes and looks at the work of Ed Gilman. Lots of stuff online from Ed Gilman.
Right, and you know, Ed's right from the same university I work for. You know, and I live in the state that he worked in, and still I'm telling you
that. We can edit my bit out, that's fine. Okay, last question then. It's one I like to end on. I did warn you in advance. Let's start with Amelia. What's your favorite book about trees? It's the Arboricultural Association book club. Amelia, you're up first. What's your favorite book about trees?
Right, I'm going to show you. This is Shohin Passion. It's probably back to front. And one of the joys of this one is that Roland, who actually put it together, needed some help translating the English version. So myself and my other half, Ross, got to actually help do the translation. And it's a phenomenal book. And there's some beautiful illustrations and photos of his collection and his trees and his development. And absolutely, if you want a sort of coffee book table, sort of beautiful pictures of bonsai, but also some phenomenal information, it is definitely my favorite.
Brilliant, thank you. Rob, your turn.
Okay, so in keeping with my very verbose personality, I'm going to have to show you two. Okay. This first one is Design with Nature. It was written in 1969 by McHarg. Okay, he's a landscape architect, or was a landscape architect from Scotland, who wound up at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. When I read this book, it changed everything I was thinking about. It made me begin to realize that the alteration of the fundamental ecological cycles, processes in ecosystems due to human development was what I really needed to focus on. And somebody asked, how do you do it? That's how you do it. It's not a big book, right? Except you got to have the will to do it. Anyway, the second book, one I just got done reading. The author's name is Henry Lawrence. This one's a little tough to get, but if you go on Amazon or whatever, you know, you can get everything online now, right? This one was published just a couple of years ago. This is called City Trees. This is a history of trees in cities, mostly a Western perspective, okay? Starts out in medieval times in Italy and works and winds its way through the United States in the end, and Australia. Excellent book, puts our job, at least the part of our job that's truly within the municipal boundaries, into a historical perspective, and you begin to realize, like, there's a reason why we don't know a lot about this. We ain't been doing it for very long.
Thank you very much. And there's already some people asking about links to about where to get these books, but we can put them, we can make sure we make them available, and when it goes on YouTube, we can make sure the links are attached on there so people can go and find them. It's like Richard and Judy's book club. This is, we can immediately increase sales of obscure tree books. is just remarkable. Okay, well, Rob, Amelia, thank you so much. Really, that was just a joy to be involved with. Thank you. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you to everyone watching at home. Hope you enjoyed it. It's going to be online, so you can watch it again and encourage all your friends and family to watch it as well. And please check out the website for all the other stuff we've got on there. And hopefully we'll see you next week, next Wednesday, for Arborist Question Time. And that's it. Look after yourselves. Take care. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.